So I was going to talk about Pink Floyd and the history of Pink Floyd and Pink Floyd's influence on current music and everything today. But then I decided to do something that I thought was more worth my while. So I'm going to talk to you guys about the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, because general understanding that's key to understanding global politics and that sort of thing, which is a big part of our world today. So the IMF is an organization that watches over the global economy and the economies of its member countries, trying to provide economic stability so there aren't huge economic downturns or huge economic booms. And you think a boom would be good, but if it's too large and too fast, it can create crazy inflation, which is terrible. It's actually worse than an economic recession. It also has become a kind of a loan system for developing countries. And that's something I'll talk about in a little bit. So like I said, the IMF its main point is to watch over the global economy. And it was started after World War II by 48 leading countries, like pretty much US, Great Britain, all those guys who are really affected by it, because they realized that part of what led to the World War II was the huge economic depression from the Great Depression and its effects on the global economy. One way countries can shore up their economies is by importing less and exporting more, except that actually hurts other countries because you don't have anywhere to sell your goods to. So this is a chart showing just from 1929 to 1923, imports fell by more than half. So you can see things weren't in good shape. After World War II, economic swings became less pronounced, partially due to this and partially because of the realization of how they affect peace and all that. So yeah. And now a little bit more background info regarding lending to developing countries. World War II led to massive decolonization of empire countries such as England, France, all of that. Pretty much all of your African countries today came from that. And in 1969 was pretty much the end of decolonization, because pretty much the empire shed all of their colonies, which led to huge amounts of countries that needed funding in order to create good infrastructure and get their own economies going. And so they turned to the IMF for loans, which actually isn't the primary function of the IMF. It's a secondary thing that, as you will see, can have some negative effects. So just between the period of decolonization, specifically 1969 and 1986, the IMF began using a trust fund to fund these countries. And in order to receive money, these developing countries had to meet specific economic standards set by the IMF and specific, infrastructure building goals. They had to follow what they needed to do when and repay the money back at a low interest rate. But when you're, borrowing billions of dollars, a low interest rate is quite a bit of money. And so over a short period of time, only between 1978 and 1981, those 3 years, not even including from 1969 to today, the IMF's poor policies regarding this and its misuse of its loaning facilities cost developing countries over $22 billion. Not lent them $22 billion, but that's how much they had to repay in loans, and what they lost from the economic stipulations. And a good example of this is Jamaica. Jamaica has been highly involved with the IMF and the World Bank since its, since the end of its numerous revolutions and regime changes. In 1983, Jamaica finally decided to take funding from the IMF to build up its infrastructure. And as soon as it took that money and started following the IMF's stipulations, their economy actually showed a negative growth because the IMF stipulations weren't well thought through. They were more designed for already developed countries, which is the original purpose of the IMF. And so Here's a quote from Truth or Life and Debt, a documentary on Jamaica and IMF. It says, the IMF assumes the combination of increased interest rates and cutbacks in government spending will shift resources from domestic consumption to private investment, a great way to boost your economy. It is further assuming that keeping the price of labor down will be an incentive for increasing employment and production. Increasing unemployment, sweeping corruption, higher illiteracy, increased violence, prohibitive food costs, dilapidated hospitals, increased disparity between rich and poor, characterize only part of the present day economic crisis as a result from borrowing from the IMF. That's partially because the IMF policy dictated that, I know, I'm not playing, but I'm just gonna keep going because this is a hot button issue for me. The IMF stipulated that Jamaica needed to develop its tourist industry and its agriculture exportation, specifically bananas and things like that, which led to, it made Jamaica's economy totally dependent on outside sources, and even for just the basic needs of its citizens. It's actually cheaper for Jamaicans to import milk and things from Cisco and corporations like that than to produce their own wheat or dairy or anything like that, just as a result of this and the high inflation it caused. Yeah, so now you'll hopefully understand why the IMF, is propagated by larger countries, because it causes dependency on the poorer countries, provides them with markets to export their goods to, which is what led to World War II. And you can also see why developing countries are somewhat portrayed as bad guys in the media when they don't accept loans from the IMF or the World Bank, because you think, oh hey, we're trying to help them out, but in the end, it results in this. So there you go. Hopefully you understand.